4:47 local time, somewhere along the northern coast of the Sea of Azov. A Russian A-50U mainstay, airborne early warning aircraft, is orbiting at high altitude, roughly 220 kilometers from the nearest confirmed Ukrainian position. Its crew believes that distance makes them untouchable. They are wrong. Ukraine's Air Force confirms the engagement within hours. Open-source flight trackers note the aircraft's sudden disappearance from the pattern it had held for weeks. And Russia's already tiny AWACS fleet never again flies that close to Ukrainian territory. This is how Ukraine forced that retreat, and why it matters more than almost any single event in the air war over the past 2 years. Here is what most coverage missed. The A-50U is not just a surveillance platform. It is the connective tissue of Russian air operations, the system that coordinates Su-35 intercept vectors, cues S-400 launches against Ukrainian aircraft, and extends Russian radar coverage hundreds of kilometers beyond what ground stations can achieve. Losing one doesn't just remove an airplane, it degrades the entire network it was holding together. That asymmetry, one aircraft, systemic impact, is why Ukraine reportedly accepted significant operational risk to put a Patriot battery within range of this target. A Patriot PAC-2 interceptor costs approximately $3 to $6 million per round, depending on variant and contract. The A-50U runs roughly $330 million per airframe, and production stopped decades ago. Russia operates, or operated, somewhere between 6 and 9 of them. Open-source analysts tracking the conflict estimate that figure has dropped by at least 2 confirmed losses since early 2024, with a third airframe potentially damaged. Ukraine did not need to win a missile exchange. It needed to make the arithmetic unbearable. What's most surprising about this engagement is not the shot itself. It is the patience that preceded it. Ukrainian air defense units do not move Patriot batteries forward casually. Each launcher represents years of training, tens of millions of dollars in hardware, and one of the scarcest assets in the Ukrainian inventory. The decision to push a battery toward the Azov coast, close enough to threaten an aircraft orbiting well behind Russian lines, required weeks of planning, careful signature management, and the acceptance that the battery might draw a retaliatory strike the moment it fired. The Russian A-50U had been flying a predictable orbit for an extended period. Open-source flight tracking data, cross-referenced by multiple independent analysts, showed the aircraft cycling through the same general pattern at altitudes between 8 and 10,000 meters, far enough from the front to feel safe. That predictability was the vulnerability. Ukrainian ISR, ground-based radar cueing, allied intelligence sharing, and commercial satellite observation had enough data on the orbit timing to narrow the intercept window. The fire control solution was not a reaction. It was a planned shot. The Patriot PAC-2 GEMT variant carries a blast fragmentation warhead and is designed primarily for ballistic missile defense, but its engagement envelope against large, slow-moving aircraft at high altitude is substantial. Published range figures vary, but Western analysts discussing this engagement have referenced intercept distances in the range of 150 to 160 kilometers for a high-altitude, non-maneuvering target. The A-50U, flying a predictable orbit without any evasive profile, was close to ideal target geometry. Large radar cross-section, known trajectory, minimal countermeasure capability against a ground-launched interceptor closing from below. One obstacle nearly derailed the operation before it began. The battery's forward movement had to occur without triggering the layered Russian ISR network, including the very A-50U it intended to engage. Ukrainian forces reportedly executed the road march in segments, using terrain masking and emissions control procedures that kept the battery's radar signature suppressed until the final firing position was occupied. A timing error at any stage, a radar activation at the wrong moment, a satellite pass at the wrong time, would have exposed the battery's location and potentially invited a preemptive strike. The margin was narrow. The execution held. Here is the question worth sitting with at this point in the story. How does a military with a fraction of Russia's air defense resources consistently threaten platforms that Russia considers safe at depth? The answer is not simply better missiles. It is better intelligence, better positioning discipline, and a willingness to accept tactical risk for strategic payoff. Ukraine does not have enough Patriot batteries to defend everything, so it chooses moments. It picks targets where the asymmetry is most punishing, and it fires when the solution is clean. The engagement itself, based on Ukrainian Air Force statements and open-source reconstruction, appears to have been brief. A single salvo. The exact number of rounds has not been officially confirmed, though 2 interceptors per engagement is standard Patriot doctrine for high-value targets. The missiles were in the air for a period consistent with an engagement at the outer edge of the system's effective envelope. The A-50U had no meaningful ability to evade. At its operating altitude and airspeed, a survivable brake turn against an inbound Patriot interceptor would require maneuvers the aircraft was never designed for. The crew's options were limited from the moment the missile left the rail. Russian electronic warfare assets in the region were active. They are always active. But the Patriot's guidance system, using semi-active radar homing in the terminal phase, is not trivially jammed. The interceptor homes on reflected energy from the battery's own illuminator radar. An adversary attempting to break the lock needs to suppress the ground station, not just the missile. Russian EW in this theater has demonstrated effectiveness against simpler guidance architectures. Against Patriot terminal guidance at close range, the results have been less consistent. Here is the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. Russia knew Ukraine had Patriot. Russia knew Ukraine had ambushed the first A-50U in early 2024. And yet the remaining aircraft continued flying patterns that, while further back than before, were still within reach of a battery willing to accept the risk of a long shot. The logic from the Russian side appears to have been that distance provided safety. It did not account for Ukrainian willingness to move forward, to accept the exposure in exchange for the shot. What this tells us about the current state of the air war is significant. The contest is no longer simply about who has more missiles or more aircraft. It is about who is willing to accept more risk in exchange for asymmetric payoff, and who has the intelligence infrastructure to know when that risk is justified. Ukraine has demonstrated repeatedly that its threshold for accepting battery exposure is lower than Russia expected. That asymmetry in risk tolerance has reshaped the entire air engagement envelope over the Black Sea and Azov regions. The aftermath was immediate and measurable. Open-source flight tracking analysts noted that Russian AWACS activity over and near the Sea of Azov dropped sharply in the days following the engagement. Aircraft that had previously held orbits roughly 200 to 250 kilometers from the front pulled back significantly further. Western analysts estimate the pullback was on the order of 150 to 200 additional kilometers, a distance that meaningfully degrades the radar coverage those aircraft can provide to Russian ground and air forces operating near the contact line. That degradation has cascading effects. Without AWACS queuing, Su-35 patrols operate with reduced situational awareness. S-400 batteries relying on data-linked targeting from airborne radar lose resolution at longer ranges. The coverage gaps that Ukrainian aircraft and missiles can exploit become wider. Each A-50U lost is not just one airframe gone. It is a systemic reduction in Russian air domain awareness that cannot be fully compensated by ground-based radar, because ground-based radar cannot see below the radar horizon the way an airborne platform can. Russia cannot replace these aircraft. The production line for the IL-76 airframe used as the A-50's base was restructured decades ago, and the specialized mission systems, the Shmel radar complex, the communication suites, the data processing architecture, are not in current production. Each loss is permanent. Open-source analysts assessing the Russian AWACS fleet in mid-2026 estimate that operationally available airframes may now number fewer than half a dozen, with additional aircraft in various states of maintenance or repair following damage. The fleet is being consumed faster than it can be sustained. Here is the take that will draw some disagreement. Russia's decision to continue flying the A-50U at altitudes and distances that Ukrainian Patriot could reach was not a miscalculation by field commanders. It was a systemic failure of Russian Air Force doctrine to adapt to the reality that Ukraine was willing to accept battery exposure to take the shot. Russian planning appears to have assumed that the cost of losing a battery would deter Ukraine from forward deploying. That assumption was wrong, and it cost Russia at minimum 2 irreplaceable platforms and the permanent behavioral modification of what remains of its AWACS fleet. If you follow this conflict at the operational level, not just the headlines, but the actual patterns in AWACS orbit data, Patriot battery movement, and Su-35 activity reports, you already see what this engagement confirmed. The air war over Ukraine in 2026 is not being decided by missile counts or sortie rates alone. It is being decided by who is willing to accept more risk at the right moment against the right target. Ukraine has consistently made that calculation more aggressively than Russia anticipated. The doctrine lesson is straightforward. High-value, non-maneuvering airborne assets, AWACS, command aircraft, tankers, are now threatened at unprecedented range by relatively small numbers of advanced surface-to-air systems in the hands of a motivated adversary with good intelligence. The safe standoff distance that made these platforms survivable in previous conflicts no longer exists when the opposing force is willing to move its launchers forward and accept the exposure. Every Air Force planning for contested airspace should be studying this. 3 questions for the comments. First, at what point does Russia's AWACS attrition become severe enough to fundamentally change the operational calculus for Russian air-to-air operations over the contact zone? And has that threshold already been crossed? Second, Ukraine accepted significant battery exposure to take this shot. Was that trade-off operationally sound, or did it unnecessarily risk one of its most capable air defense assets for a single engagement? Third, if Russia disperses its remaining AWACS to airfields deep inside Russian territory and restricts their operational orbits to extreme range, does that neutralize the Ukrainian threat? Or does it just create a different set of coverage gaps that Ukraine can exploit with other systems? The A-50U is gone. The orbit it held for weeks is empty. And the airspace over the Sea of Azov in June 2026 looks nothing like it did 18 months ago. Subscribe to follow the next engagement breakdown. We track a new frontline development every week with the same level of operational detail. Will Russia's remaining AWACS fleet survive to the end of this conflict, or is Ukraine systematically eliminating the capability entirely? Comment yes or no, and tell us why.